So that was my modern story, and it was co-created with two groups of women, an older group and a group of young mothers. And I just think it's a really powerful story, and I've always had lovely feedback from that. So I'm going to let you into a little secret. We had a feedback session after that story in the live, and we've decided that the feedback is so important that we're going to include the feedback from now on. My second story today is a 200-year-old story. So we went from the stories that we were co-creating, and now we're going back to the well of tradition. And I've heard this story told in Scotland, and I've always felt of it as being a really Irish story. It's a story from my childhood. So here we go. There was a young man living in Cove, just outside of Cork City. He had a charmed life. He got up in the morning and his mother had his breakfast ready for him. He went out and he did the things that men do, and he came in for his lunch and she had the lunch ready for him and a fine dinner every night. But over time, the people and the things that kept him content in his little place, they began to disappear. First his father went to heaven, then his mother, and then his beloved horse. And he found himself in the little cottage in Cove, all on his own. And sure, don't we know what that feels like now? So he was sitting inside in his cottage, looking at the whitewashed lime walls, and he was thinking to himself, oh, I'd love to see people. I think I'll go out for a walk today. Now, in those days, they didn't have the fine clothes that we have today. So he pulled on his summer trousers, and then he pulled on his winter trousers, and then he pulled on his gansy and his big coat, and then he put on his shoes. And he looked at his shoes and he said, shoes, where are you taking me today? And his shoes took him out of the cottage, and he thought that they might bring him up the hill, but they didn't. They turned, they walked down the headland towards where the wild Atlantic Ocean meets Cove itself. And he sat on a great big rock there. And as he sat on the rock, and as he watched the waves coming in, and being sucked back out into the heart of the sea, he began to think of all the great store of stories that his mother used to tell him. The beautiful stories of the sea, of Tír na nÓg, the land of eternal youth, of Capall na Mara, the white horses of the sea. And he could see the white heads of the waves rolling in now. And he kind of went off. Do you know the way you'd be thinking of a story and suddenly you're gone away into it, way into that beautiful story, and you almost forget that you're here, but then pop, you're back in the world again. And when he came back, there was a woman sitting next to him. Who are you? He said. My name is Mary, she said. And who are you? And what are you doing here? And he said, well, I was a bit lonesome in my cottage, so I came out. He said, what are you doing here? She said, sure, I wanted to see a lovely face, and you have a lovely face. I'm a small bit hungry, she said. Have you anything to eat on you? And with that, he put his hand into his pocket. In those days, the Irish people had a tradition of a práte de fóca, a potato in your pocket. They'd boil a great pot of potatoes in the early mornings in their skins, and that way they'd hold the heat. And if a child was going to school, or if you were going out on a long journey, you'd put one potato into one pocket and the other potato into the other pocket, and it would keep your hips warm and your hands too if you put your hands in your pocket. Well, of course, they'd gone cold at this stage, but he took out the two potatoes and he gave one to her and he ate one himself. And she said, aren't you a fine, rare boy now? That potato was lovely, she said. Thank you so much. And then she started looking in her bag, and it was a big old woman's bag, and it kind of smelled like a wet dog. And she started pulling this scarf out, and she pulled it, and she pulled it, and she pulled it. And then He was thinking to himself, I hope that's not for me. When she picked it up and she said, that's for you. And being the well-reared boy that he was, he started to wind it around his neck. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 7 times that scarf went around his neck. And when he smelt it smelt of a lovely warm kitchen, of apple tarts, of happy memories. And he was so glad that his mother, that this woman had given him this scarf and brought his mother back into his mind. Thank you so much, he said. Sure, I'm delighted to have met you today. And I'm so glad to have met you too, she said. That scarf comes with a piece of wisdom, she said. Does it, he said. What kind of wisdom? Ah, no, she said. A scarf is a barrier, and not just against the weather. Remember that, boy. A scarf is a barrier, and not just against the weather. I will, thanks very much. And he was thinking to himself, sure, God help her head. But the scarf is lovely, and it was nice to see somebody. And off he went home. This was around this time, it was coming into October, and everything was smelling lovely. And after his happy walk and talk and his new scarf, he felt happy for himself. And he was delighted with himself in his cottage, thinking of the conversations he had with the woman. But as the days started to shorten, he began to get lonesome again. And he thought to himself, wonder what that woman is doing now. I'd like to meet her again. And he pulled on all the clothes and his little scarf and his shoes. And he said, come on, shoes, let's go and see if we can find the woman. And he went out of his cottage and he headed left and he started going towards the wild Atlantic Ocean, heading towards their rock. And as he was going, who did he come to see sitting on the rock? Only the old woman, as if she had been waiting there for him. She clapped her hands with joy when she saw him. Hello, boy, she said. It's so nice to see you. I was just thinking to myself, I'd love a lovely session, kind of like a fruit cake, a session with a bit of a song, a bit of a story, a dance, and maybe a small bit of music. What can you provide? He said. Well, I don't sing songs, he said, but I tell stories. Well, how about I sing a song and you can join in? And I think the song she sang was Thras na nu danta dal shir, Slán leis an uignas slán leis an fear. Slán leis an uignas, he said. Goodbye to the loneliness. Oh my God, he said. And that's what happens when I'm in your company. And that's what happens when I'm in your company, she said. Now tell me a story, she said. And he told her a story of Oisin and Tiernan Og and the land of eternal youth, where people live forever and they're so happy and they have sessions every day. And if they want to travel to the land of Ireland, to Éire herself, they get up on the backs of Capall, Bán and Mara, the white horses of the sea, and should they bring them across on Araga, the sea, to where they can visit the people of Ireland. Oh my goodness, she said, I haven't heard that one in a long, long time. And then she said, I have to give you a present for the lovely session that we had. So she went into her bag again and she was pulling things out, and she had a small little container. It was about that size, a small little container. And inside the container was the spice of life. Do you know what the spice of life is? The spice of life is Solin, salt. And then the young boy said, salt, thanks very much. And he was looking puzzled, and she said, no, she said, did you ever have a plain old potato like we had last time we met? And she said, but then if you put a warm bit of butter on it and a small little sprinkling of Solin, doesn't it taste much nicer? Doesn't it transform it? It does, he said. You speak an awful lot of sense. And he began to listening to her with a different ear now. That comes with a bit of wisdom, she said. What wisdom this time, he said. And then she looked at him and she came in very close and she said, salt can cure you or kill you, boy. It can cure you or kill you. And then she sat back, well satisfied with herself. Salt can cure you or kill you, he said. Thanks very much. Use it sparingly, she said. And she waved to him as he left and walked up a road very like the road behind me here. And up he went into home and he thought about all the things she said, the beautiful song she had sung, the story of his mother. Sure, it kept him going for ages and ages. But then it was coming into the Christmas season, the season when all the young families are together and it's so full of joy. But if you're on your own, it can be a very lonesome time of year. And so it was for our young man. Oh, he remembered the lovely Christmases that he'd had in this house. He took down on Bosca Driachta. That's the Irish for the magic box. And that's what his mother called the place that she kept her little fipperies. And he opened up the box. And in it were all the things that had made their cottage so bright at Christmas time. There was the paper chains that she'd made from the crepe paper that she'd collected. Yellows and reds and greens, and in the later years, golds and silvers. Oh, the memories that fell out of those fipperies. There was something that she'd carved herself, a little robin, and there was something that he'd made in school that she kept as a treasure. When he had put them up around his cottage, he felt the absence of the people that had gone before. Before he knew it, he was pulling on his clothes and walking out into the late night. He thought to himself, well, the woman won't be there now. It's in the middle of the night. The big, fat, cold moon, the last of the year, was hanging over the wild Atlantic Ocean. It was so big and yellow that he could almost see the sea of tranquility with his bare eye. He slouched down the road to where the wild Atlantic Ocean was creeping in the dead of night to the edge of Era. And he sat on his rock. And as he looked out, he could see a shape, a dark shape, moving against the dark of the night, coming closer. And as he watched, the dark shape took on the form of the woman, and she was dragging something behind her. He rushed towards her and said, "Can I help you?" "Ah," she said, "I knew this was meant for you." And when he looked, it was the bridle for a horse. But his heart ached. Why hadn't he saved money? Why didn't he have enough to buy a horse? And she caught the ache in his heart as it leapt into his eyes. "What's wrong, young man?" she said. "What's wrong?" And he told her about how he couldn't afford a horse. "Ah," she said, "that's your head talking. What does your heart say?" He thought about that and he said, "My heart says I'd love a horse." And he began to believe that he might get a horse. She looked at him and he noticed for the first time how old she was. The wrinkles around her eyes and her mouth, the wisdom in her eyes. And he looked into her eyes and both of them came to the same knowing. "This will be my last Christmas," she said. "Oh," he said. And then he looked away because it was hard to look at the woman. And when he looked back, she was holding up the bridle. "One last wisdom for you, my boy," she said. "What is it?" he said. A harness gentles a horse. A harness makes a horse docile." "Thank you," he said, and he took the weight from her and looked away once more. When he looked back, the old woman was gone, and the harness was in his hand, and the absence was in his heart. At the time of the big full moon, the veil thins between this plane and the next. And that happened now. He could see the ocean, the wild Atlantic Ocean, as the white horses, Capall na Mara, were making their way towards land. But he couldn't hear anything. There was a perfect silence. He turned then to look in the field to the left, and he saw her there, the most beautiful horse he had ever seen. She had a sheen of pure silvery white, almost like the moon herself. She had the most beguiling eyes, and he found he could not look away. He started to walk towards the horse, knowing that she was on Capall Tríochta, the magic horse, knowing that she was Capall na Mara, but unable to stop himself. Closer and closer and closer he came to the horse, and he thought to himself, oh no, she will bring me to the sea. And as he got nearer to her, the words of the woman came back to him. A scarf, boy, is a barrier, but not just against the weather. He unwound it from around his neck, and he made a great figure eight, putting it under his legs, crossing it over his head, and tying it in a great knot. And then, because he could not stop himself, he sat up on the back of the horse, and she rose in one fluid movement and began to walk towards the sea. Capall na Mara, Capall na Mara, don't drown me, he said. Don't drown me, I'm not ready yet. But she kept moving towards the sea, and then she began to hear a noise, the noise of his glutes hitting on her back, and she realized that he wasn't stuck. The magic hadn't worked, and she got worried, and she started to run towards the sea. And then he put his hands into the mane of the horse, because Muirish, he'd ridden horses from before he could walk. And if he did, the mane of the horse started to turn into snakes and bite the hand of Muirish. Oh my God, he thought, until the words of the woman came back into his head. Salin boy, salt, it can cure ya or kill ya. And he put his hand into his pocket, and he took out the small little salt shaker, and he spread it over the mane of the horse. And if he did, it turned back into the mane of the horse again. The less worried he became, the more worried the horse became. She was almost at the edge of the water now, but she reared up in front of the moon, full of fear. And when she did, she threw back her head. And if she did, he took the harness and he threw it over the horse's head. At once, she became docile. She came back down onto the sand, looking longingly at the sea as the waves were making their way up to her hoof. But not quite. She was trapped now in the land of men. And Muirish caught that bridle, and on the way home, he told the horse of all his plans. Oh, Capall na Mara, I'm going to call you Banrian Bon, the White Queen, and you're going to live in a stable out behind my place, and you're going to eat before me in the morning, and we're going to plough the backfield, and we're going to set seeds, and we're going to have a great crop, and I'm going to buy another horse, a black horse, and you'll have a friend. And she listened in silence, but she would not look at him. And everything that Muirish said happened, the best crop he had ever sown. And he did buy the horse, but little by little, Banrian Bon was becoming thinner and thinner, and she refused to look at him, until the day came when he brought her into the backfield, and he caught the bridle, and he said, Ban Rian Bon, you changed my fortunes. I'll never forget you, and I'll always love you for it. But I would not like to be stuck in the land of the fairy, and I don't think you like being stuck here. It's your choice. I love you. I think you love me, but you might love your home more. And he took off the harness. And when he took off the harness, she looked at him one last deep look. And then she swished her tail, jumped over the little stone wall, down the headland, and back to the sea from whence she came. Ah, Murish didn't have an Banrian Bawn anymore. He had this story, and it's lasted for 200 years. Isn't that amazing? You know? So, because this is a beautiful live event, I'm actually going to open it up now to some reaction on the story, because it's very strange for storytellers not to be able to hear and interact with their audience. So I'm going to turn off that mute button now. So there we go. And I'm going to see what people thought of that story. What did you think of that story? So you can unmute yourself now.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was lovely, Maria. It was really moving again. It's actually similar. There's a lot of the symbolism is similar to some Scottish stories that I know, you know.
Yeah.
But then that's common, isn't it? These magic objects that go across stories, you know.
Yeah, we swap stories back and forth across the Irish Sea. And up there in Antrim, there's only 12 miles between Antrim and the Mull of Kintyre.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the old days, people would swim for it or go in tiny little boats. So there's so much of the mingling of the bloods between the two, between Scotland and Ireland, and our stories that went back and forth. Yeah. Thanks, Claire.
And of course, the giants jump back and forth as well.
That's true, Francis.
The giants causeway, isn't that how it happened?
Yeah, that's it.
We threw the rocks across.
That's it, you know. So we went from a story that was completely modern, born in this millennium, and that story belongs to the last millennium from 200 years ago. And isn't it amazing how you can mix stories? There's no barrier between stories old and new. Isn't that just
yeah? And I think that's part because we're talking about the human condition always, and those feelings like loneliness and wanting a different experience and coming across it. And then there's a magical element in the sense that it's how you see something new. It can be magic for you, or it can be just somebody else. Maybe it's mundane, and I think it's how you open yourself to things.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I see Vince there, you know, from Tip, and Vince is a person I often play with new stories, and he told me this beautiful, true story one time about a tinker man. Vince, would you mind sharing that snippet there?
Yeah.
You're unmuted, yeah.
I am muted, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's nice to meet you all. Yeah, it was a story about a guy who was my grandfather on my mother's side, who used to have a good friend who was a traveller man, and he would they'd meet up for various things, but their passion, both of them, was horses. My grandfather was a ploughman, and the traveller men, of course, would be after their horses. They loved the horses. So one thing about him was he was a kind of a witch doctor of his time, because he was a natural healer before natural healing became a thing. And he would have all kinds of cures and medicines that he would know about, and he'd be able to make them from what he'd find around him. So the guy, well, it was my uncle actually, so my grandfather's son, who had a very, very sick horse, sick with a mange. And normally the mange is easy enough to cure, but this, whatever it was very, very difficult. And actually the vets had even given up on the horse, and it had become quite hard to look at them because the mange is a kind of a scarring thing, a kind of a skin disease that they get. So that one evening anyway, the traveller man, his name actually was Willie, was cutting a hedge for him, and he was up on top of the hedge so high that he could see the horse out in the field behind. So he asked what was wrong with the horse, and he obviously knew before he even asked. So they explained what was wrong anyway. So he examined the horse and he said, he said, that horse can be cured. I can't remember what name he had for the thing it was, but he didn't call it mange. And off he went to a little fort that was beside my grandfather's house with a big Hessian bag. And he filled it up with all kinds of stuff from there, and a lot of ivy. And the ivy is kind of the base, I suppose, or what they start off with for the kind of like a soup. And they boiled up this massive pot, because everybody that time had a big pot. They'd boil stuff in it for their hens and their pigs and their animals, with these secret ingredients which we never found out about, for about at least one full day, maybe more than a day, and reduce it down to a kind of a thick broth, which they applied to the horse then, like a green gooey stuff, for about a week. And the horse was cured. It absolutely worked. Even from the second day, you could see the improvement. And by the end of the week, there was hair growing back on the bare skin that had been. And there were lots of other things as well, but that's the one I think I told you about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing that with us, Vince, and I'm just going to stop the recording